heck is a role-playing game?
I'm glad you asked. Basically, a role-playing game is any game where you take on the role of a person or a thing, and you pretend to be that person or thing for the duration of the game. Now, there's one problem with that. Even though that definition is correct, it applies to a lot of things. So in order for me to explain to you what a role-playing game is, I'm also going to need to explain to you what a role-playing game isn't. So here's what we'll start. Something that's really common, everybody knows, Pokemon. So if you're playing Pokemon, you're going to take on the role of a Pokemon trainer. You gotta catch them all. In the game, you collect those cards, you build a deck, and then you sit down in an arena or at your battle academy and you play cards in a strategic sense to conquer your opponent and win. The problem is that that's not a role-playing game. So even then, if you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, where you're doing something similar, you're playing as this elite collector of mythical creatures, or even if you play Magic the Gathering and playing Commander and you're taking on the role of this commander and using them, Magic is also not a role-playing game. Those are collectible trading card games. Another very well-known one, Catan. I also love how it kind of disappears with the green screen. That's fantastic, but even though you're playing as a settler and you're collecting resources and you're interacting with other players, it's not a role-playing game. This is a strategic board game. Think kind of like with Monopoly. Even though you're pretending to be involved in this real estate business and living life, playing a real estate developer, that's not really a role-playing game. It's just a way to strategize in a different type of game that we'll just call those collectively board games for now. Another example, let's take this one, Planet Unknown. In Planet Unknown, kind of like Catan, you are a galactic settler instead of settling on another continent. And you're going to collect resources. You're going to possibly tell a little bit of a story, but not very immersively. Is that a role-playing game? No, that's not a role-playing game. Again, that's a strategy board game. So let's look a little bit farther. Let's see something else. Game Holotype. In Holotype, you play as an archaeological survey team. You have to go and collect your fossils and assemble them. You study things, put them in your library. Is that a role-playing game? No, again, that's a strategy game. You're managing resources and you're kind of playing a role, but that's not a role-playing game. That's a board game with some roles in it. Like a 5-minute mystery. You're an investigator, solving mysteries. Is that a role-playing game? Though there are role-play elements, again, this isn't a role-playing game. Because in 5-minute mystery, the game is just solving the mystery, where a role-playing game is going to be much more in-depth than that. Well, then people say, what about Villainous? You get to play the villain. Well, not exactly. You're kind of retelling the various stories from Disney, and you're collecting the cards as you play to be the various villains. That's really not a role-playing game. There's not an overarching story. There's nothing being exchanged verbally between the players that's outside of some kind of specific mechanic. People don't really get to make up what they would want to do. So then some people would say, what if I want a game where I'm gonna be this really good race car driver and I'm gonna race everybody and I'm gonna shoot guns and, well, okay, so we have Thunder Road Vendetta. Even though you're playing as someone in a post-apocalyptic world, there's no story. It's a board game. Pretty simple. What about Zombicide? Well, you are trying to survive the zombie apocalypse. That's true. You are playing the role of a survivor. That's true. You may be telling a little bit of a story, but this is a strategy game where you are attempting to survive using dice and combating zombies, but the story isn't there. That's kind of at the heart of role-playing games, is a story. So there's another game that does have components of stories in it. If we look at Warhammer 40K, this is the ultimate starter set, and in it you have Space Marines and Tyranids. These are Tyranids, these are Space Marines. So there are books called Crusades. And in these crusades, you track all of the statistics of the various units in your army, and each of them can be killed or can grow better at things over time. So there's some story there. Is that a role-playing game? It's not quite a role-playing game. It's strategic. It is a war game. It has role-playing elements. That's not a role-playing game. Let's look at one more. Werewolf. Other games similar to it I've heard called Murder or the game Vampire. Essentially, you're sitting around, one of you in your group is the werewolf, and everyone else is trying to figure out who the werewolf is before the werewolf can take them out. So even though you're playing the role of a werewolf, is that a role-playing game? No. You're acting, sure. You're not really telling a story. So what is a role-playing game? I'm gonna start with this one. This is the game Shadowrun. And this game takes place in a futuristic alternative version of Earth. And in that alternative version of Earth, you have magic, you have technology. Everything has just changed. And you create a character, and your dungeon master, your storyteller, your game master, or like in Call of Cthulhu, they would say your keeper. There's different words for it. We're gonna say game master right now. So in Shadowrun, your game master either buys a pre-written story or writes one of their own, and each player is going to be responsible for creating one character in that story. And then as that story is told, all of the people who are playing the game say what their character will do. Sometimes they say, I would do this, or sometimes they actually will act it out and say, I'm going to attack him, and pretend to be that person. That is the role-playing aspect of a role-playing game. The game part is that it's collaborative storytelling, often using dice or cards to randomize the outcomes so that no one knows what's really going to happen. You don't know if what you really want to do is actually going to be successful until you roll those dice. And the DM or the GM, the game master, will look at those dice and gauge that against the score that you needed to have to be successful. So maybe you roll high enough that the game master says, wow, you not only succeeded, but this great thing happened. Or you could roll the lowest number possible. In some games, that's a 1. And if you roll a 1, you didn't just fail, you failed miserably. So what's another role-playing game? How about this one? This one is Dragon Age. This one is based on a video game of the same name, Dragon Age. A recent one came out last year. Before that, there was Dragon Age Inquisition. There's been quite a few of them. But in Dragon Age, you create a character. That character is involved in a very specific story, and this just provides the setting for that story. So Dragon Age, that's a role-playing game. How about another one that's pretty popular? This is Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Pathfinder is based on Dungeons & Dragons, but it's no longer Dungeons & Dragons. In Pathfinder, again, you create a story along with the storyteller, your game master, playing one particular character in that story. Whether you act it out, whether you dress up in cosplay, or whether you just sit around in street clothes with your friends and eat pizza while you're telling this collaborative story, doesn't matter. That's a role-playing game. 2 more examples. Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is a horror game, but it's a role-playing game. You play the role of an investigator who's trying to solve paranormal mysteries around the world while trying to battle monsters and madness at the same time. And finally, Dungeons & Dragons. This is the world's most popular role-playing game, and in it, you create a fantasy character known as an adventurer, and your adventurer goes, you guessed it, adventuring. And so the stories that are being told can be very broad. If you're playing a game that's pre-written, Waterdeep Dragon Heist is kind of a heist story. But if you want to play something really dark, you could play something from the Ravenloft campaign setting, like Curse of Strahd, which is all about vampires and surviving the Domain of Dread. But you see, there's the difference. You know that there is a story to be told, that your character is a part of that story, And that's what we're doing, collaborative storytelling. So what is a role-playing game? It's collaborative storytelling, but it's a game where you take on the role of a person or thing and you play that person for the duration. Thank you. This has been James Explains.